the cloud. Okay, welcome everyone. Today we're talking about controversial topic, which I didn't think would be controversial, but it's contrastive learning, supervised, self-supervised learning along the side. Can you make it full screen, please? Mahfuz is presenting the paper, and I will have to run away, unfortunately. I was waiting for this presentation, but I will watch the recording. My schedule changed. Good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to this reading group discussion. So today I will be going through a paper entitled Supervised Contrastive Learning. This paper was actually published in New Reads 2020. And so this paper is in some sense an enhancement of our traditional supervised classification settings. So instead of traditionally approaching the classification problem, they proposed an alternative way of dealing with model training, and that alternative approach can be treated as supervised contrastive learning. So, okay, so let's first review what is contrastive learning. Contrastive learning actually works based on a data set that consists of pair of samples, and there can have multiple positive pairs and there can have negative pairs. And in the following slides, I will be going through how these pairs are actually formed to make the data set. So for this slide, let's consider that there are some pairs are positive and some pairs are negative. So the whole purpose of contrastive learning is to keep the positive pairs close to each other in the embedding space and keep the negative pairs apart from each other. So the main idea of this paper is that, and the contrastive learning has already been proposed in the self-supervised setting, but this paper is actually proposing an extension of our self-supervised contrastive learning to apply the idea of contrastive learning in actually fully supervised setting. So how this contrastive learning can be applied in full supervised setting, because in traditionally self-supervised setting does not use any level information from the data set, but when contrastive learning is used in fully supervised setting, it uses label information. And another considerable difference with self-supervised contrastive learning is that in traditionally self-supervised contrastive learning uses per batch, each has one positive sample and multiple negative samples. And for supervised contrastive learning, per batch, there are many positives and many negative samples. So this slide is a good one to understand how the data set will be constructed for every batch. So suppose we have a bunch of samples. Some samples are cat, some samples are dog, for example. So for every, do you have any question? Okay. Every sample can be considered as an anchor, and in self-supervised contrastive learning, all the other samples are treated as negative samples. So if we pair up with the anchor and any other samples from the same batch, that will be treated as negative samples. That means that pair will be treated as negative samples. But if we use some form of augmentation of the same anchor and pair them up, then it will be treated as positive samples. So for every batch, there is only one positive pair formed by actually augmenting on the anchor, and for all other samples, it will be negative pair. But if we use label information from the same batch, the samples from the same class may form multiple positive pairs. For example, on the right-hand side, we can see that the positive pairs can be formed by data augmentation and also taking samples from the same class. So the black and white puppy is actually of the same class as the anchor on the top. So it is possible to construct multiple positive pairs and multiple negative pairs from the same batch. Any question? No? Okay. So the major contributions of this paper is actually they extended the traditional concept of self-supervised contrastive learning to fully supervised contrastive setting. And they have shown that it is not only an extension of self-supervised contrastive learning, it also outperforms traditional cross-entropy laws for the full traditional cross-entropy based supervised classification setting. Okay, so, and they have also shown that it is more robust to traditional, though they have started with self-supervised with comparison to self-supervised contrastive learning, but basically their work is related to the traditional approach of dealing with classification problem, supervised classification problem. So they have repetitively shown that supervised contrastive laws can outperform cross-entropy laws. That is their main goal, actually. And it is not only in terms of top one accuracy, but also it is robust to natural corruptions. That means if the model is tested based on out of distribution samples, then cross entropy loss is not much robust as compared to supervised contrastive loss. And they have also shown that cross entropy loss is less sensitive. Sensitive. Cross entropy loss is sensitive to hyperparameters. That means if we change the hyperparameter settings for supervised classification using cross entropy loss, then the performance varies widely when cross entropy loss is used. But supervised cross contrastive learning loss is less sensitive to cross entropy. Less entropy to range of hyperparameters we've seen. Yeah.
Do they also look at training on smaller subsets of the data set? Like if they can get better performance even with smaller sample?
No.
Sample efficiency?
Yeah, they didn't go through smaller samples, but they checked on different hyperparameters like their sizes, optimizers, and they have also checked on the corrupted out of distribution test set.
Yeah, but I wonder if this is also more sample efficient. Because to me, it seems like they just have more signal basically than either cross entropy loss or contrastive.
Yeah, I think so.
I wonder that maybe it's easier to also do it also, like less samples.
Yeah, I think probably you are right, because from their results, from their demonstration, it is clear that during training, they are capturing more signals from the training set.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, compared to cross entropy loss. So yeah, I think your guess is right that it will possibly require less number of samples to perform equally. Yeah. So this is their results actually at a glance. So they have tested their learning technique over different architectures using different kind of augmentation techniques. And they have shown that supervised contrastive loss is outperforming over the other baselines, like cross entropy loss with cut mix data augmentation, cross entropy loss with auto augmentation technique, and so on. Okay. So what is their training procedure? Their training procedure actually consists of 3 modules. First of all, the augmentation module. The augmentation module actually works on the original samples. It performs some kind of augmentation on samples, and then they have an encoder module that encodes from the data and converts the data to create a long embedding of some dimension, we'll see. And on top of that embedding, they used a projection module to train their model, but that projection module will not be used for actual classification tasks. And finally, actually they have trained their model in 2 stages for the actual classification task. So in the first stage, they used data augmentation, encoder, and projection module. And for the second stage, they trained a linear classifier on top and made the other portions of their model, for example, encoder module, they make it completely frozen. And for training the linear classifier, they didn't use supervised contrastive loss, they just used cross entropy loss. But they also mentioned that it is possible not to do the second stage at all. Only the first stage would be enough. So this is their architecture, and they have compared with comparative different architectures. So the left one is absolutely traditional supervised cross entropy based setting, and the middle one is their proposal, and the rightmost one is their proposal, and the middle one is self-supervised contrastive learning setting. So as we can see that in traditional cross entropy based supervised setting, the training procedure is actually using the label information directly into end. And for this self-supervised contrastive setting, they are using the same encoder, but they are trying to form pairs of positive samples and negative samples from the same batch. And in their case, only one positive sample is possible. That means one positive pair is possible through data augmentation. That is what they did. They are passing the same image with some kind of augmentation. And they are trying to make the pair as close as possible in the embedding space. But for the supervised contrastive setting, as you can see on the right, they are using label information. That means they are picking up any samples from the same class, from the same batch, and trying to keep them as much close as possible in the embedding space. So this is their, so this one is their encoder, and this one is their embedding output of the encoder, and this one is the output of the projection module. So this is stage 1. Stage 1 is totally related to the training of the encoder network, basically. And in the second stage, they trained a linear classifier on top. And they have also mentioned that stage 2 and stage 1 can be done simultaneously in the same setting, but they didn't do it to make it separate.
But one thing I would, so do they only maximize or minimize the distance between the anchor, or do they also minimize it between the other positive sample?
Oh, okay. So what they did is, I will show it in the next slide. But for now, for example, this is the main sample, right?
That's the anchor, yes.
So this is the main sample. For example, this is the anchor. So from this anchor, multiple data augmentation is possible, but they did only one augmentation of the same sample. And there are some other samples from the same class, both augmented or not augmented. So they try to keep those pairs as close as possible if
They have the same augmentation.
it can be from the same sample augmented, or it can be from the other samples from the same class. That means,
But do they also minimize the distance between an augmented pair from the same class and an augmented pair from the same class? Two different samples, but both augmented from the same class.
yes, that is what I'm saying.
The anchor.
What?
You mean without the anchor?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Not to the anchor. I mean, that's why it's called the anchor.
Okay, let me make it more clear. So actually they didn't use the anchor at all. They didn't use the anchor. So what they did is, for example, there are 5 samples in the batch. So they created 2 augmentations per sample.
Mhm.
So 5, 5, 10. Forget about the original samples. So we have only 10 samples augmented, all are augmented.
Mhm.
What they did is they took one augmentation,
Mhm.
augmented sample, and they paired with other augmentation from the same sample or other augmentations from other same class.
Okay.
So they didn't use the anchor. They used the anchor to create augmentations. They didn't use the anchor during training.
Okay, but that's not what it's in the figure though. In the figure, they use the anchor with a different class.
Yes, but they didn't do it. I will show it to you.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, no.
They didn't do it. Yes. First of all, we have original base of n samples. They created 2 copies of augmentation. So we have now only 2 n samples. None of them is original. All of them are augmented samples. So what they did is they pick one sample. For example, it is ith sample from these twin augmented samples, and the rest of the samples are called A of I. They pick each sample from the batch and contrasted. Okay, so let me make it clear. This is self-supervised formulation. This is not their formulation. So they tried to show step by step what they did. First of all, they showed the formulation of self-supervised fashion. Then they went for their own formulation. So for self-supervised fashion, so we have 2 n samples, pick one sample, and only one from the rest can form the positive pair for the self-supervised setting, right?
Yeah, they just contrast with the negative.
Yeah. And they just contrasted with the rest of the pairs. So only the positive pairs can be the previous index or the next index, because they have ordered all of the samples, all of their augmentations in consecutive fashion. X1 and X2 are 2 augmentations, X3 and X4 are 2 augmentations for the same sample. So if they randomly pick one sample from these 2 n, then the positive member can be immediately before this sample or immediately after this sample, right? That is what they did. And for supervised contrastive formulation, they actually tried out 2 kinds of formulations, but later on they have found that not all formulations work consistently. Only one of them works better than other. So what they did is, now they have multiple positive samples. How? So we know that AI is the rest of the samples, right? AI is the rest of the samples. So from the rest of the samples, pick those samples which have the same levels. So now PI have all the samples from the same class. So take every pair of positive samples, calculate loss, and then average over the loss. Sum them up and then calculate the average. This is one formulation. And another formulation is before calculating loss, that means before inserting into the log, they actually averaged over the logits, or the dot product. They averaged over the dot product, and then they fed into the log term. And they have shown, they actually termed it differently, that if we average after calculating loss, then they term this loss as L supervised out. That means they are averaging outside of log. And if they average inside of log, then they term the loss as L supervised in. And with their experiment, they have found that if they averaged after calculating log loss, then the performance is better than the other version of the loss. And using some inequality, they also showed that for the same batch, it is always this loss is the in version of the loss is always less than the out version of the loss. So they thought that the in version of the loss cannot capture the whole picture. So they actually use the out version of the loss. And they tested these two versions of the loss on ResNet architecture using ImageNet dataset and found significant difference between them. Okay, this is their first experimental results. They used they experimented on CIFAR 10 and CIFAR 100 and ImageNet dataset, and they compared their performance against CMCLR, self-supervised contrastive learning technique, and traditional cross entropy loss and max margin loss. And as you can see from the table, that supervised contrastive loss outperforms almost in every case.
How do they mine the batches? How do they decide which samples to put in? This is just random.
The best size?
You know, how did they just determine the samples that they're going to put in the batch?
Yes.
That means how?
Like self-supervised mining is like a huge problem, right? Like which pairs are going to be negative, which pairs are
Randomly, self-supervised SimCLR, you mean?
No, just in general, like getting the correct negative pairs is like a huge problem, which is like an NP hard, I think.
Yeah, I think they randomly picked. They randomly picked from the same batch.
Because like there's a lot of algorithms that look at finding perfect negative pair. Because if you find a negative pair that's very far away from the anchor,
Yeah,
that could be a very good pair to
I
compare.
understand. So you mean that you are talking about hard positive and hard negative, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, so they call it like self-supervised mining examples,
Yeah.
making sure that you get the correct
Yeah,
one.
so for triplet loss, it is very important.
Right.
As you say, yeah. But they are saying that for their supervised contrastive loss, as they are going through all possible pairs, they are actually considering hard positive and hard negative too.
So what he just said, there is no, the CA is every sample, not just the negatives.
Not just in the whole batch.
Yeah, it's every sample, not just the negatives. Because in Sinclair or whatever, like the negatives exclude the
Right.
positive sample. In their case, that's not the
They
case.
only exclude the one sample, right?
They don't exclude any. So,
No, because it's still AI.
yeah, but there's no AI minus I.
Yeah, it is. It's still the same, right?
I don't think so, not the way they've written it.
So
Because they-
ZA still does not include ZI, right?
I believe it does.
Which one?
ZA does not include I, right?
GA,
ZA.
which one? Oh,
Z.
GA is A belongs to, let's see, A belongs to AI, everything, except the
Yeah,
sample.
I, except I, yeah. Yeah. So it's,
Everything.
so that's my point. So then,
That's actually, I thought you said the opposite.
Hmm?
Never mind.
Yeah,
right, so that's why I was wondering, because you still have the problem of like finding good thing.
yeah.
But okay, I mean, maybe it's too far for the paper or something.
Did the original Sinclair paper?
I don't know, but there is a lot of follow-up work on the fact that like selecting the negative pairs is like an art project.
That's it.
This is close to sincere formulation, I think.
Right, no, sure, but I mean, more like, how do you select how do you create the batch where ZA are good, like, for example, if ZA would be all dogs, then in the normal cell supervised version, then your loss is gonna be not super good. In this case, they don't have the problem because they take the specific target variables into account when they make the batch. But I was wondering, there's still a question of like, a chair and a table may not be a good negative pair, while a dog and a chair may be a better negative pair, right? There's still that.
But in traditional SimCLR or self-supervised setting,
I'll talk about papers later that looked at the fact that it's really important to select the correct samples.
yes.
But apparently, I mean, it's fine if they didn't talk about that. I was just wondering if they did specifically address that.
So they say, yes, they talked about that. They say that in their method, they are considering hard positive.
Okay.
And hard negative.
Okay.
For example, why it is hard? Because in traditional self-supervised setting, they are using some kind of augmentation to pair up, right, to create positive samples. But they are using samples from other, from the same class, but completely different sample, right?
Right.
So this pair is hard positive.
Yeah.
Right? For example, yeah,
No. So I understand that alleviates the
Yeah.
problem a little bit. I was just wondering if they specifically, like if it's random, you can also, for example, think about the fact that if you do a batch with dogs versus cats, and then you do a batch with dogs versus elephants, then you do, you know what I'm saying? Like you can, there's a whole lot of ways you can pair them up still, even if you use hard positives and hard negatives. If that makes sense, because there's different classes and maybe you find that one class and another class are not clustered well. That's what they do in mining often, is like they see like, oh wait, these classes are not, they're not clustered well, so we specifically try to do batches where we
No,
make sure that
I understand your point.
Yeah,
You are actually talking about one step ahead.
yeah,
They didn't do it, they just did some improvement over self-supervised.
right, no, so that's why I was wondering if they talked about that. I mean, it makes sense that they did.
I think they are in the middle. They are not using same augmented sample to pair positives. They are using label information to make it more hard.
Right.
Yeah, but not the hardest, as you say.
Right.
Yeah, that if some classes are very close, they
Right.
should not be negative. Or if it is negative, it will be easy negative.
Right, for example, I mean, if already elephants are not clustered with dogs, like doing those batches over and over again may not actually improve your accuracy, because I mean, they're already apart.
Yeah, I understand your point. Yeah, they didn't consider those kind of information during best conversion. Yeah. Okay, so they also experimented on image data set using auto augmentation technique for data augmentation on ResNet architecture. Okay, so for different architectures, they actually used different augmentation technique, but in their findings, auto augmentation works the best. So cross entropy with mixed up augmentation 93.6.5 accuracy. So, but their proposed supervised contrastive loss with augmentation technique on ResDate architecture provided the maximum top 1 and top 5 accuracy.
It's still pretty close though.
Which one? Yeah.
It's, they also don't show standard deviation.
Mhm.
Wonder if it's
But,
within standard-
Yeah,
I wonder if it's within standard deviation.
no.
Probably. I mean, I don't know if it is.
Yeah, they did during their sensitivity experiments on hyperparameters. Yeah. So this is the result from their robustness experiments. What they did is they took the ImageNet C dataset, and the model was trained on ImageNet dataset, and the test was done on ImageNet C dataset. That is actually out of distribution data set, ImageNet C. And they use two metrics to compare their performance: relative mean corruption error, right? Yeah, relative mean corruption error and mean corruption error. So they have shown that with supervised contrastive loss, if these out of distribution samples from ImageNet C is used to test the model's performance, the overall corruption error is far less than the traditional cross entropy based implementation.
I mean, this is really close. Like these,
Yeah.
like these graphs, I'm like,
And
I
actually,
wonder how much is even due to the loss at that point, if it's like this close.
their hyperparameter stability check is only on one of the architectures, not the one in which they're actually very close.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
So-
because this, like, I mean, I like, you know, I'm not saying that it's like not due to the loss, but like at this point, if it's this close to each other, these lines, I really wonder if you can say it's more robust to corruption. I mean, maybe at the lowest part, like 25%, like the corruption severity of 5, maybe there you can say it's like different, but like for the first 3, I mean, it's even hard to distinguish the lines.
Yeah, it's too close, right? So this is the result of effect of hyperparameters experiments. They have used different kinds of augmentation techniques, and they compared with the cross entropy based implementation. So they found that if we keep every other setting same, just change the augmentation principle, then the result is far higher, right? Yeah, and if we just change the optimizer, the standard deviations of the traditional cross entropy based implementation is much higher than supervised contrastive loss based implementation. So for augmentation optimizer learning rate, for every hyperparameter, the standard deviation of supervised contrastive loss based implementation is much lower than the cross entropy based implementation. And also, if we just look at the base size effect, for every base sizes, supervised contrastive loss outperforms cross entropy based loss.
So SimClear outperforms their model and the transfer learning.
Yeah. For transfer learning, I didn't find that their implementation is doing better than SimCLR or cross entropy.
I guess that does make those. Yeah, but that, I mean, the point of Sinclair is that they don't use any set, like any targets. So
Right.
if they would more logically find more general
Yeah.
features.
Yeah, Maybe the case, yeah.
So, I don't know, it begs the question. What's the point?
Well, actually, TJ sent me this.
Hmm.
The reviewers are actually really critical of whether this is better, especially because it's like way more computationally intensive.
But it was still published.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that is their last result. So at this point, if you have any question or further clarification for me.
even, I think one even says that this is bad for the environment.
Yeah, they have mentioned it. They have mentioned it in their broader impact section of the paper.
Yeah, because
They
it
have
says,
mentioned it that it is computationally intensive.
yeah, reviewer 3 says it seems one major downside of this contrastive learning framework is that it needs to be trained much longer.
Yes,
I mean, 700 epochs versus 200, and then only getting like what, like a. It's, how much is it, like 1%? I mean, that's, I think, a lot in the, but it's very, it's 0.5 or something, right? For the, compared to supervised, like 0.4, 0.5.
yeah, yeah.
But it's like almost, what, 3 times the number of epochs? That is, I think that's a good point, honestly. Like, if they, so they said this is costly and environmentally unfriendly.
Yeah, they
Kudos to
mentioned
you, by the
it,
way.
they mentioned it.
Yeah, that's wild. Also, I wonder, like, I think the computations of the loss itself, like, just not looking at the epochs itself is like way more costly. And so that's why I wonder if at some point, like, if you're doing this for 700 epochs, maybe after 200 epochs, only consider samples that are misclassified, because it seems super excessive to just keep training on.
Yeah, yeah. Right, it is computationally expensive. If we don't have any further question, maybe we can stop here, right? We can stop the recording if we don't have any question.
Does anyone else have a question?
I'm not sure.
So I wonder what the main. Oh, that's me asking if Snap Inc. is Snapchat. I wonder, so the thing that I'm wondering is, I guess, like, I understand the fact that they wanted to do this research, I guess, and it makes also sense that like companies would want to do this research because they do have a lot of, targets, like they have a lot of data.
And they have resources too.
Right, but so I wonder, like, yeah, the question is a little bit like, I think these results are like fine, like, like showing these accuracies and stuff, but I would wonder, like, what does a loss look like? Like, well, how does this change basically
Okay.
the type of solution that it finds? Like, it just seems a little bit like, the numbers are pretty close, and I understand that often happens with these things, but I just wonder, like, there's no real like in-depth analysis of the
Okay.
loss function or something, which I would have personally liked.
Yeah, they didn't do it, but one thing they mentioned in their broader impact section, that if the classification model is deployed, for example, for self-driving car, increasing 1% accuracy may
Oh, no,
save
for sure.
lots of lives.
Yeah, so I see, I mean, yeah, it's a little bit of a faulty argument. It's like, but no, and I don't think it's a bad paper at all. I mean, it's good that this is being explored, but I just wonder, like, it seems to be super focused on the exact performance increase. And I think nobody is really surprised that if you use actual target variables, that it will improve it. I just wonder more about, like, how does this change basically the loss landscape? Like, would you go to a different solution because you're being pushed in a certain direction by these targets, as opposed to self-supervised, or are the solutions still pretty close to each other, right?
Yeah,
Is it
yeah.
like something, like the features that you obtain for these data sets with self-supervised learning, how close, like, they may be a little bit more general, which you can see for the transfer learning, and that's why I'm really interested in, like, do these features really, like, what is the difference between the features that they find? Like, is it just a tiny bit more to the,
Yeah, that means you are saying that did they do any analysis in the
Well,
embedding space?
I know they
Or
did,
seems
but so
tailor and
I would have personally, I mean, I would have probably accepted the paper, but I would have liked as a reviewer to see something like that, because I think that's the main point, right? It's like, nobody's surprised that if you add targets that it's better. I think most people would think that would happen. And it's good that they showed it nonetheless, so that's why I would give it an accept, but it's just more like the mechanism of why it's better and why self-supervised learning still performs so well, even if you add target variables to its loss, because I'm honestly more impressed almost by the fact that self-supervised learning is still fairly competitive, even though, yeah, with 1% extra, you would kill less people with cars, I guess, but like still, it is pretty competitive. That's what I would be most interested in, is like looking at like.
But self-supervised contrastive loss has one problem. It is taking only one pair against multiple negative samples.
No, sure. But so for example, let's say you train this model and then you find the features that it finds, right, for each image. I wonder how different they are from the same embeddings from this supervised model. If it's really that different, like how close they are to each other, because that could also help us understand self-supervised learning better and improve self-supervised learning, right? In terms of how we push these features to something that's more similar with the targets. I mean, all in all, I mean, it seems, yeah, pretty good. I think,
but self-supervised setting actually tries to see different aspects of the same sample.
right, no, yeah.
But supervised contrastive loss does not look only on the different views of the same sample. They're trying to push all of the views from the same class to be close to each other, right?
No, I understand, but so it seems to me that there is going to be some similarity between the embeddings that they find, because the accuracies, this may not be true. I mean, you can get the same accuracy maybe with wildly different embeddings, and they're not the same accuracies. They're definitely better for this method. But seeing that they are still, within 1% of each other, I do wonder how close the embeddings that self-supervised learning finds are. Just like what does self-supervised learning pick up on that this method does not pick up on, and the other way around?
You are interested in basically some kind of similarity analysis of the embedding.
Right, because I think this work, most importantly, apart from the fact that it's more applicable to real life because it has better accuracy, is interesting to inform future self-supervised learning research, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we know that with targets, this is kind of the upper bound that we find, at least for this specific method. Can we achieve that with self-supervised learning by improving the loss such that we get closer to those types of features, finding those types of features in our data set? I don't know.
I think it can be a future work, right?
No, for sure, but
Yeah.
that's what I would be, I mean, since we have 10 minutes left.
Any other question? Noah has multiple questions in his mind, I'm sure.
I'm curious as to why they didn't, I don't even think they mentioned clip. Which I guess it's fine, because it requires multiple data sets, but still. I don't like the results, and I don't like that they included the positive samples in the set of all.
So can you just point to the equation?
Yeah, so they do ZA at the bottom of the contrastive loss, and that includes the positive samples.
Yes.
Because PI equals P from A, or
Which-
only the,
No, AI
yeah, it's all.
includes all, right?
Yeah, so
Yeah, includes
also the
all.
positive samples, so it does include I, but it does include all the other positive samples.
Yeah, which makes less sense to me, but I don't know, maybe they have a reason.
Yeah, I wonder why, do
Yeah.
they talk about that?
But I was trying to explain here that it matters only the numerator, right? So if you are keeping the same denominator and you are trying to increase the numerator, so that is what I was trying to explain here. So you have n samples.
Right, I agree with you theoretically, but I wonder in deep learning, you can have instabilities based on numerical differences. So I wonder, I mean, your gradient descent is going to be different because it's going to be normalized differently.
Yeah, I don't think it matters.
I mean, yeah, but I don't know, if I,
This actually ties back into what you were saying about mining.
Yeah.
Because now if your positive samples are just randomly selected, they're also mixed in with these randomly selected negative samples.
Yeah.
I think that puts a lot more of the weight on how they mine the samples.
I think so too, because now you're doing the inner product, right? So if your positive samples are close to your negative samples, even though you don't, you know what I'm saying, even though you don't consider them as I, they can still change completely your normalization factor. Like, let's say, because you can, if you pick ZA so that the denominator gets super large, then it seems already like it's a good class, like it's a good classification, right? So if your ZA are far away from all the other samples,
So how does softmax normalize probability scores for each class? In the denominator, you are getting everything, right?
sure.
You are getting everything.
I mean, I agree with you like theoretically, but because deep learning is so sporadic and doesn't follow exactly, you know, the sort of like, because we're doing mini batch SGD, right? So this is true if you do the full data set, but that's not true per se if you do mini batch SGD. So different normalization factors can have an effect on which
Yeah,
direction you go to with one batch, and then you may end up in a totally different location than if you used full data set. Because I agree with you, yeah, I mean, theoretically, it doesn't really make a difference if you're just trying to minimize the top, but the problem is that you're using mini batches. And that's why it ties into the mining part and also may change a little bit the solution that you get.
One thing I can think is by including the positives in all, it means they can have any number of either negatives or positives.
Right, no, I mean,
But if they don't, if it was only the ratio between positives to negatives,
sure.
then they would want generally more negatives than positives.
Well, I don't think it's per se bad, by the way. I mean, I'm just wondering why.
I think that's it. I think that's why.
Okay.
I think it's because that way they can, it's agnostic to the number of.
Yeah, I
positives,
think
the
we
number
can
of
stop the
negatives.
recording and then
Sure.
we can discuss.
Yeah, everyone left, so. If this was only the negatives, and you have more positives than negatives.
Right, but they do the
Your-
same number, right?